Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar on how and why school governors should support staff mental health and wellbeing. My name is Hannah Stolton and I'm the CEO here at Governors for Schools. As part of our Wellbeing Governors campaign, this term we will be focusing on the mental health and wellbeing of staff in schools. We know that during the pandemic, teachers and senior leaders, including governors themselves, have faced a barrage of difficult decisions and actions to ensure pupils' needs are met. We see that it's taken a toll on teachers. They're telling us they're exhausted, that they're having to balance being in school and managing remote learning, and obviously that is a challenge. Leaders are facing daily new challenges against the backdrop of COVID, which is affecting the whole community. It's not just in times of COVID, though, that we were concerned about staff wellbeing, so we want to take away some things that you can take forward as we return to some sort of normality. Today, we have a panel of experts who will discuss how, as a governor, you can support staff during these challenging times and why it is so critical to take action. So, to welcome our guests, we have four people here with us today. Sinead Brearty, who is the CEO of Education Support. It's a UK charity dedicated to the wellbeing of education staff. And Sinead is also a governor as well. Linda Untitled, who is a senior content editor at the Key for School Governors, another governor. Michael Eggleton, who is head of school at Charles Dickens Primary School and Nursery in Southwark, and also a governor and a trustee. And finally, Mark Solomons, who is a very experienced school governor of over 20 years, a chair and a trustee. And he is also the CEO of Welbee, which is an organisation which supports staff wellbeing in staff wellbeing. During the session, we will hear from each panelist, and then I'll be asking each of them questions. So if you do have questions, if you can put them into the chat, then we'll monitor those as they come through. I'll hand over now to Sinead, who is our first speaker, and she can talk to you a little bit about the challenges that schools are facing. Thank you, Sinead.
Many thanks, Hannah. I'm just going to hopefully manage to share my screen. Something's changed since the last time I tried this. Let's see if we can make it work.
We can see it, Sinead.
You can see it.
Yep.
Excellent. Yep. Brilliant. Okay, so challenge number one dealt with. Many thanks for inviting me, and it's lovely to be in a community of governors. I know that you will all have been working hard with your respective schools and doing your best to support during this time. And that support is really well appreciated, is one of the things that I'll be able to give you a little insight in from some of the research that we've done. My job today is really to set the scene a little bit about the topic of conversations. And the first point of that is some of the terms that we use. And mental health, for those of you who haven't had a lot to do with the topic of mental health to date, I think the most important thing to say is it's something that we all have. When we're talking about mental and emotional health, we're talking about our ability to participate really in our personal, professional and community lives. So I guess if you think about it as our ability to cope with the demands and the stresses of life, then that's probably a good place to start. Well-being is a slightly broader topic, and the Office for National Statistics talks about it as a measure of how we are doing, whether that's how we're doing as individuals, communities, or indeed as the whole nation, and how sustainable that is for the future. So hopefully that helps a little bit with some of these concepts, just to get that kind of basic understanding of them. And obviously mental health and well-being are a very critical agenda point for everybody in the current climate. I just wanted to say a little bit about what we know about mental health and well-being in the education sector. My organisation does a bunch of things, including research about the health of the workforce. And we produce an annual index with a survey sample of over 3,000 people in the education workforce, looking in detail at mental health and well-being. I'm not going to give you lots of data. You can go to our website and find as much data as you want on this topic. But I just want to highlight for you the really big themes that came out of the research we published in November 2020. Based on a survey that had taken place in July 2020, so very much in pandemic, but also linking it to a longer term picture. So what we found this in July 2020 when we ran the survey is that stress remains high. Stress it's plateaued, but it's plateaued at a very high level. Now, I think we've seen subsequently, as we've gone into this academic year, further spikes in stress in school. But the backdrop that's important for us all to hold is at a very high level of stress to begin with. We've got 75 to 85% of people working in education describing themselves as stressed routinely before COVID. When we then tested that again in October 2020, we saw that spiking up to about 89% of senior leaders in schools describing themselves as stressed. So there is a very significant and serious issue with stress in our schools. We're also seeing an increase in the number of symptoms of poor well-being. So people reporting more issues that would indicate that there might be indicating the stress that they're under and a link to mental health issues. So that might include things like insomnia, tearfulness, difficulty concentrating. And although we don't have huge numbers of more substantial issues like panic attacks in absolute numbers, relative to the general population, we see relatively high levels of this in the school workforce. So it's again a moment for us to just try and understand what's happening and recognize that it's actually quite serious in terms of the health of our education workforce. We know that mental health support is variable between schools, and more than half of the workforce feel that they don't have enough guidance about their own mental health and well-being in the workplace. About a quarter have access to an employee assistance program that allows them to speak to a counsellor, for example, and less than 10% have access to any kind of independent supervision, which if you think about some of the pastoral staff, you think about senior leaders in school, safeguarding leads, those who are dealing with special educational needs, there is a whole cohort of staff who are carrying quite a significant emotional burden in our schools, but who have little or no support to help them digest that, which is a topic we think is quite important. There are barriers to reaching out for help. There is more stigma education about declaring a mental health issue or asking for help in the face of significant unmanageable stress than there is in the general population. So our culture in education here is something we need to look at. And basically, overall, the well-being of education professionals is lower than the general population across the country. So it's not a very, I'm a bit of a miserabilist, you have to say. I'm sorry, this is your lunch hour and you've made time for this webinar, and here's this woman rabbiting on about how awful it is. I'm going to try and say something positive, but I don't have fantastic amounts of good news for you on this topic. Happily, colleagues will have some good news about some of the things we can do when they speak later. But I will just draw to your attention something that helps us understand what the issues are is looking at why people leave the profession. We know we have a problem with turnover in education. We have 1 in 3 qualified teachers leaving in their first 5 years. We have currently about 60% of senior leaders stating that they are considering leaving the profession. That has clearly increased under COVID, but again, underlyingly, the levels were high anyway. People are thinking about leaving for some fairly straightforward reasons that we'll all recognize. Volume of workload is a big deal. We have senior leaders routinely working 80 hours a week for pretty much a year now in this COVID window, which is by anyone's measure unsustainable. And it's not just volume of workload, actually, the intensity of work has a significant impact on well-being and mental health as well. People don't feel valued in the role that they're doing. They want a better work-life balance. They don't like bureaucracy. That really doesn't, type of work matters. So there's some workload that's perfectly acceptable, but bureaucratic work that doesn't appear to the need of the pupil really drives educators mad. They don't like operating in target-driven cultures, particularly if the target feels like it's become more important than the learner. Unreasonable demands from managers, and that includes us as governors, because for senior leaders, we are their line management, if you like, and lack of resources in schools are all reasons why people are considering leaving. We did some research right after the first lockdown to try and understand how that was for educators, and this, I think, helps set the scene again to what's going on right now. And what was mental health declined further in the first lockdown. We believe it's even worse this time round. We'll be taking some data on that over the next month. Appreciation really matters. So a huge amount of the workforce said they felt appreciated by leadership, and they felt appreciated by colleagues. And actually, I think that sense of appreciation in the school has been really important. That collegiality has helped carry people through. It builds resilience. It's very, very positive, and that really is something positive for us to take away. Unfortunately, they feel hugely underappreciated by government and by the general media. They feel fairly, somewhat appreciated by the general public, but the media and some of the headlines we've seen over the past 12 months does affect how teachers and people working in schools feel about the work that they do. And we could, I think, again, as governors, we have an opportunity to acknowledge and recognise and appreciate, and we know that this makes a very direct contribution to boosting people's resilience and their well-being. People have struggled with work completion. How do you know if children and young people are getting the work done? Government guidance changing all the time, and just the level of workload, and also holding a lot of concern about health and safety for themselves, about learning priorities for children and young people, and assessment and how that's going to work. And also pupil mental health being a pretty significant issue for them. I'm going to pop up some contact details here. We run a free helpline, and it is staffed by clinicians, by counsellors. Anyone working in education can phone that and access support in the moment, qualified, good quality support. We also have a bunch of resources on our website that you're welcome to go and look at and use, things on anxiety, on bereavement, on depression that might be helpful. And I've stuck in some contact details there as well. But I think just to make the point, which is sort of, I think, what my job is here, around why it's important, I would say to you that the mental health and well-being of our educators matters for a lot of different reasons. It matters socially, because if we have children spending big chunks of time in environments that have significantly higher than normal levels of stress, that is going to have an impact on them themselves. So that's something that we need to think about. In terms of the education system, it matters. We estimate that poor mental health costs at least almost $2 billion per annum in the costs associated with reduced performance and absenteeism in the sector. That's based on work by Deloitte and Touche. That's not just me with the back of a fag packet counting that up. Obviously, we know it matters to pupils in terms of their learning outcomes. There's a whole raft of research that that supports the significance of the pupil-teacher relationship for outcomes. And it is self-evident that the experience of being in the class of a stressed teacher is going to be very different from that of being in the classroom of somebody who feels well supported, trusted, they're able to have that sense of professional identity recognized. So I think it matters for many, not least because it matters to the individuals who are employed in our schools. Chronic stress leads to very significant health problems. And that's something which we as governors, I think, need to be cognizant of. So I would love to think that we can go away from this and pay attention to the well-being of our senior leaders in particular, think about the mechanisms for staff to express their experiences and staff voice, having the opportunity to listen and respond. And then as governors, just thinking about the impact of our own decisions on the well-being of the school staff. If we want to do something, can we let go of something else? Or do we really need the thing that we're asking for? What are we going to do? What difference will it make? If we can be disciplined with ourselves and just think about our own impact, that's a really good start. Thanks a million. I will stop sharing my screen and hand back to Hannah.
Thanks ever so much, Sinead. We'll share the contact details and the resources after the event. We do have a question that's come in from Jeff to say, do we sufficiently consider why people become teachers? Is there something about the vocation that is more likely to lead to stress and, I guess, disappointment in the system, I think? You're back on mute, Sinead.
Still, all these months in, I'm still on mute. A really insightful question, Jess, and I think I think the concept of vocation itself is probably becoming a little bit problematic. So I think, we now hear people talking about working in education as being akin to military service. You can go and do an amount of time, but then you have to get out because you can't stay in it for life. Obviously, plenty of people do stay in it for life, but I think the nature of vocation is changing. But is it to do with the people? I think it's a difficult question, but I think there is enough evidence that there is stress coming from the workplace, coming from policy, coming from the shifts in policy over the last 30 years, some of which have been incredibly positive and some of which are really well intended but have negative outcomes, but have resulted in a very intense accountability system, a lack of trust in the profession demonstrated or experienced by the profession in certain ways, and workload and overwork. And I think those things in any sector would be problematic for the well-being of a workforce. But it's a question we could spend several hours discussing in detail.
We could indeed. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Linda now, if you're ready, Linda, and unmuted. Yep.
Okay, let's see if I can get this right. Yep, there we go. Oops. Are you able to see my screen? Yes. Okay.
Yes,
sorry, give me 1 second. Having technical difficulties, as you can see. Okay, so my name is Linda Untitled, and I am a content editor at the Key for School Governors. And I just want to thank everyone today for joining us for the webinar. I see that we've got a full house, so that's very exciting. As you've probably already worked out, I am not from around here. I'm originally from Austin, Texas, but I do have a fair amount of experience in the British education system. Before I joined the Key, I trained as a teacher with Teach First, and I used to teach year 5 at a primary school in central London. And as Sinead had mentioned, I am one of those 1 in 3 teachers that got out within the first 5 years. So today we're going to be talking about a few things, and there's bound to be some overlap between some of the speakers here. So my focus is going to be more on the practical side of governance. So I'm going to get away from some of the overarching theories and goals and just kind of give you some tips and tricks that you can walk away with and put into practice right away. So today we're going to be talking about what well-being isn't. We're also going to be looking at the 3 key considerations you should have when you're thinking about well-being in your school and what strategic well-being looks like. But before I get into that, I really just want to give a big shout out to all of my fellow governors who are here today. Governance is challenging on a good day, but this past year has been exceptionally difficult. And some of us are juggling remote work with homeschooling. Some of us have barely stepped outside all year, and we're all feeling some sort of strain on our own mental health. So we're struggling with fear and anxiety and confusion ourselves, and it feels like we can't plan a month in advance. So on top of all of that, I know that you're all getting emails and app alerts that have taglines like the 10 things you need to do for your head teacher right now, and get up to date on the latest news. And the fact is, we're volunteers. So despite that, you're still here, you still showed up. And for that, I really just want to thank each and every one of you. So if we take a look at the most recent iteration of the Governance Handbook, it makes it clear that governors have a responsibility for ensuring the well-being of their school's teaching staff. The 2020 version says that you should have regard to work-life balance of teachers in the executive leadership of your organizations. And it also says that you should have due regard for the well-being and mental health of the school leadership team and teaching staff more broadly. But there's good news in all of that. You don't have to sacrifice your own well-being to support someone else's. In fact, sometimes just being mindful of someone else's well-being can help you to be more mindful of your own. The steps that you can take to lighten the load on your school leaders and to preserve their mental health and support as well as their well-being can also work to save your own time and your own sanity. So what is well-being? I'm not a therapist, and I'm not going to launch into a speech about what well-being is or why it matters. What I do want to highlight is what well-being isn't. Well-being isn't going to be a thing. It's not a yoga class. It's not a bottle of gin. It's not even a pay rise. Well-being is a state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy. So the primary thing to understand about your role in supporting staff well-being is that it's a thing you must continuously do, rather than something that you can just give to someone else. So this is obviously a really broad subject, and I'd be joking if I said you only had to do 3 things for well-being and mental health and everything would magically improve all around you. But I do think that there are 3 key considerations to supporting well-being. So look at them as kind of like filters that you can use when you analyze how you're interacting with school staff. So whatever governance work you're planning in the moment, whether you're thinking about going into the school for a monitoring visit or preparing for a board meeting, ask yourself if your plans for that day demonstrate that you're respecting your school leader's time, that you're respecting your school leader's expertise and experience, and whether or not it's honoring your school leader's work and commitment to the care, to the children in their care. And we're just going to go over how to do this one by one. When I talk about respecting your school leader's time, I'm really talking about being sure that you're not asking them to do any more than you need them to do to move the ball further down the field. Remember that they're incredibly busy, but so are we. So it really only takes a little bit of planning and foresight on our parts to keep governance moving smoothly. There are a few things we can do to keep governance efficient. First, we can make sure that we're not adding to school leaders' workload. So we shouldn't be asking school leaders to create new reports or documents unless we absolutely need them. For example, most school management information systems, they call them MISs, produce reports on all sorts of things from attendance to progress and attainment. Learn to work with the documents that are created by your school's MIS rather than asking for new documents to be created. Also, you want to make sure that school staff aren't doing governing board work. You'll see that this is especially true with your head teacher, because often it's the head teacher setting the agenda for a meeting rather than the chair. So what I would ask is that if you're a chair, please do step up and take the bulk of that responsibility so that your head teacher isn't doing it. It's also often the head teacher that's communicating directly with the board. So as a result, the head teacher often has a dozen governors responding back and asking questions. So a really simple thing that you can do right now is create a communication tree to streamline that communication. It'll preserve time and space for your school leaders. For example, the key link between the school and the board can be through the head teacher and the chair. So if the head teacher communicates to the board through the chair and all the governors send their questions via the chair, then all the board's business can be condensed into a single email rather than 12. And as for prepping for meetings, I'm not going to teach you how to suck eggs. You already know that that you need to take steps in order to keep the meeting from going on for too long or keep it from going in circles. So if you find that this continues to be a problem, I'm just going to ask you to really make it a priority this term to tackle it. And I've popped some tips in here in the slide. You can even send them out as a little reminder to your governors a couple of days before the meeting to make sure that they do these things before the meeting happens. So when we talk about respecting their expertise and experience, we really are talking about the two distinct balancing acts that we have to perform as governors. The first is by understanding what tasks are strategic and what are operational, because knowing the difference between those helps us understand how responsibilities are divided between your governing board and your school leaders. And the other one is going to be finding that proper balance between challenge and support. I'm not going to read the slides off to you. These will be accessible to you later, but I just wanted to say that these are tricky all the time, but they seem to be especially tricky right now while there's a pandemic raging and schools are partially closed. And all of the things that we've known how to do to drive school improvement have kind of been thrown out the window. So one thing that you can do is just go back to these basics and make sure that you understand how to keep this balance going as you move forward. And finally, I'd said that earlier, you can't just give somebody well-being. It's something that you have to do continuously. Since the pandemic started, we have received so many questions with Key about how to give school leaders bigger pay rises or how to give more time off. We all recognize how hard our school leaders have worked and continue to work through the most challenging year we've ever known. And we want to do something significant to reward them. But in many, many cases, our hands are tied. The school teachers pay and conditions document really limits what we can do to reward our school teachers financially or with time off. But that doesn't mean that we do nothing. Honestly, just simply acknowledging what has happened and acknowledging an extraordinary response and rising to the challenge can go a really long way. It can't be all at once. It has to be something, it can't be something that you only mention in a performance review. Someone once described the work of supporting another person's well-being as being a sustained attack of kindness. And I think that that's a really good way of looking at it. So just, for some simple tricks, you could make sure that you're keeping track of what you see school leaders doing in the school. Keep track of those accomplishments, write them down, comment when you see them, but also make sure that they are put into the annual review. Just knowing that someone's paying attention, they see the work that you're doing, can be the difference between feeling supported and not. Also, take the time to attend school events and make those visits when you can, even if it's only virtually. For instance, if your school is giving giving a performance, make sure that you log in, because it shows that you value the work that they're doing. But most importantly, acknowledge their sacrifices. Even if you can't do anything about it right now, acknowledge what they're doing and let them know that you see it. So finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about strategic well-being, but I'm going to start that with a caveat by saying that I'm just not going to go into too much depth here, because the speakers coming after me are going to do that. I really just wanted to leave you with a few simple but effective things your school should be doing to embed well-being in your school's ethos. And you'll see the list here. It's pretty straightforward and simple. And then as far as what the board can be doing, well, the school leaders will be doing most of the heavy lifting on this. There are things that you can be doing on the board. For instance, you can appoint a subcommittee to take responsibility for overseeing staff health and well-being, or you can appoint a link governor for well-being. Make sure that you make well-being a standing agenda, and just make sure that the governing board, I'm sorry, let me start over. Not just at governing board meetings, but also when you go in to meet with school leaders. And also consider setting aside a small budget for short-term counseling or other well-being initiatives. And finally, make sure that you're familiar with the DFE's resources on how governors can help reduce workload for schools. And that's me. I'll go ahead and I'll hand back over to Hannah.
Thank you ever so much, Linda. That's great, and we'll share those slides later. We had a comment / question about the thank you, about the role of the clerk, and I think that is really key, because the clerk can make all the difference, sort of taking some of that workload from the head teacher, and sharing that responsibility with the chair. So I think definitely around the agenda and things like that, a good clerk is invaluable and can make a difference.
Absolutely, and they're actually statutorily required, so every board should have an effective clerk.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Michael now. If you're ready, Michael, and can unmute yourself.
Great, thank you very much.
Great.
Hopefully you can see my slides now. That look good?
Yes, you can. Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. I tell you what to help my well-being, and that is good Wi-Fi, because I'm certainly struggling here today. So my apologies if I lose Wi-Fi at any moment. So thank you very much for having me. My name is Michael. I'm head of school at Charles Dickens Primary School. We are also lead school in a large teaching school alliance, and we're also one of the many EEF research schools. So what I hope to do is share with you not only what we have trialled here at Charles Dickens Primary School and what we're currently using at Charles Dickens Primary School, but what also we've learned through working with other schools and what has been successful and what hasn't, and hopefully be research informed as well. So this is kind of my takeaway generally, and from speaking to my own staff, and that is that teachers want to be able to teach, and that's why they got into the profession. And the way I always look at it, just because I love planes, if you think about a pilot knows how to do emergency landings, but they don't want to be doing emergency landings all the time. That's scary. They want to be flying the plane. And it's the same with a teacher. They don't want to be flying a plane, but they want to be teaching. They don't want to be dealing with poor or extreme behaviour on a daily basis. That could be a barrier to them actually teaching. So we need to be thinking as school leaders, what can we do to support the teachers so that they can teach, so they can do what they are trained to do effectively. So one thing that we have embedded in our school is something which is very, very research informed, something that not only improves the mental health of children in the school, but also has a significant impact on behaviour, and it certainly has for us. And that's called Ruler. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is something that was developed by Yale University. It has a longitudinal study of over 25 years. It's used in hundreds of schools, and we have adapted it here for the UK, and it certainly works for us. So my recommendation would be is not just to focus on the staff well-being, but do focus on the well-being of pupils and what you can do to reduce those barriers so that teachers can teach. Little bit of information there, but if you look up Yale University and Ruler, you can learn all about what they do over in the States. So staff wellbeing for us is about reducing teacher workload, but hopefully to improve pupil outcomes. And we have trialled a few things. So what we're really looking for is Effort versus impact. It might be a large amount of effort for our teachers, but is it really having the impact that we want it to have? So we have looked at a few of those things that traditionally teachers have always done, and we've never really questioned them. So as an example, marking. So if we think about from a primary school point of view, a teacher might be teaching, let's say, 5 different lessons in the average day: English, maths, guided reading, RE, and one other, history, let's say. All of those books will need to be marked at the end of the day. If you're going to do that well, if you're going to put some celebration in there, smiley face, stickers, stamp, whatever the policy is for the school, and then to give a next step, that's going to take a long time to do it. It can take hours after school. Should that time be focusing on marking, or should it actually be focused on improving planning for the next day so you can address those misconceptions that are coming up? So we've been part of a very large research study looking at marking and actually moving away from distant marking, as it's called, after school, and actually focusing on live marking. So in that lesson, the teacher giving feedback, the teacher asking children to self-assess. There are many different ways that you can do that live in a classroom, which has a significant impact. So what we did is we got our teachers as part of this trial not to do any marking after school, not to pick up a green or a red or whatever colour pen, not to put stickers over the books, and to look at the impact. To look at the impact for the children, do they still feel celebrated, but also look at the teacher's workload. What we found is, and what all of the schools found in fact, is that workload improved significantly. Teachers had hours and hours after school to plan, to resource, and to address those next steps. But it didn't actually have any negative impact on pupil attainment. It didn't improve things for the pupils, but it didn't make it worse either. So the big question there was actually spending hours and hours after school marking. Was it useful? We have decided not, and we have found many different ways to celebrate children's learning as part of the lessons and to give that feedback. So for us, that's been really successful. Reporting, so speak to many teachers. Writing end of year reports is very, very time consuming. And if you're a parent and you've received reports or you've seen reports, often it turns into a bit of a narrative as to what that child has been taught, as opposed to what that child has actually learned. And simply because that teacher is holding so much information, they'll probably be able to give you really detailed information about English and maths and reading and phonics, etc. But if you ask a teacher, well, tell me the next steps for this child in history, they'll be able to give you a lot of detail, but maybe not as much detail. And they'll end up writing about what their child has been taught. But we share that in curriculum maps, we share that on the website. So what is it that parents actually want? So we actually asked that question. We asked the parents what they wanted to see in the report. And ultimately, they wanted to know where the children were. They wanted to know what the attainment was. They wanted to know how hard the children work, and they wanted a celebratory comment. So as a result, we were able to significantly streamline our reports, save the workload of our teachers, but also it really impressed our parents. They liked it. Now, I understand every single school is different, but I would encourage schools to talk to their parents and find out actually what is important to them, rather than just sticking to long-winded reports. Writing assessments. So again, this is something that many schools, whether you're primary or secondary, it takes up a long time to do. If we think about writing assessments, it needs to be done really well. We need to be able to judge children's writing. We need to be able to compare them to other pupils in terms of getting attainment data. And the way that many schools do this is they will get children to do independent writing tasks. The teacher will mark those pieces of writing in a lot of detail. They often have big sheets called APP grids, which is basically a tick box exercise. Have they used a pronoun? Tick. Have they used it 3 times? Can they do it independently? Have they used capital letters throughout their independent writing? Yes, they've used it here, but they didn't use it there. What are they? Are they secure? Aren't they secure? There's a lot of judgments that will go into that. And actually, ultimately, you're not going to get the most accurate piece of assessment. What I say is a secure level. Someone down the road might disagree with me. What we're also very aware through the research is, even if we like to think we don't, there will be certain bias around a children's writing. So for example, it might be simply being that a boy and a girl, you might in your head think that the girl's piece of writing is going to be better than that boy's piece of writing. Or if there's a behavioural concern regarding a child, you'll be thinking, well, I'm sure that child won't have made that much progress. There's got to be a mistake here. And you'll look at it in a little bit more detail. Comparative judgment is something that's free, something that schools can do. And what it will do is not only reduce the workload, not only will it mean that teachers will spend minimal time assessing, it's a far more accurate way of getting a piece of data for a child's writing. So what that you will do is you'll submit your writing, and then pretty much everyone who's involved in comparative judgment across the UK will judge that writing. So it will be a really secure judgment. What would take, I would say, on average, maybe 7 hours to assess a class fully, you take that down to about half an hour assessment. So a significant difference, but obviously it has a massive impact for the children. So increased reliability, reduced workload ultimately. Classroom displays. So I realise every school will have a different policy on this, and we've got to ask ourselves again, what are displays for? Are they to look pretty? Is it simply wallpaper? Is it to impress the parents? Is it because we as senior leaders like the way it looks? Is it having the impact on the children? And again, there have been studies to actually look at what is, I guess, the right amount of display to have. And the studies have shown actually less is more. In terms of children's learning, having lots and lots on the wall, having washing lines, as we call them, which is bits of rope with things dangling down, actually that can be a distraction. And a child is actually going to learn far better in an environment that is relatively bare, but has the necessities and the resources that that child needs in terms of accessing the learning. And that's what's important. So if your senior leaders have a policy where you need to be triple mounting pieces of work and changing that piece of work every couple of weeks to go on lovely displays in the classroom, then you've got to ask yourself the question, is that for the senior leaders or is it for the children? And this was that study, which I won't go into now. But ultimately, we have found that schools do a lot for staff wellbeing, and sometimes it's about just gathering up what you do well, what is actually going to make a difference, rather than simply having tokenistic gestures. The school that puts the donuts in the staff room on a Friday, that sounds lovely, but actually, is that really going to support retention of staff? Is that going to keep that staff wanting to work in your school? More often than not, it's about the workload. One thing I have learnt, and one thing I learnt this through the Bethlehem and Moorty Hospital School, which is a school within a psychiatric ward for children here in London. And I'm very good, I know the head teacher there very well. One thing he said to me was, why don't you give your staff the gift of time? If you worked in a business, you can take time off whenever you want. You can't when you're in school. You get lovely long holidays, admittedly, but you can't be flexible with that whatsoever. The gift of time is ultimately giving your staff half a day off a year, or maybe 2 half days is what we do here at Charles Dickens. And the aim is that that member of staff can simply switch off. Now, this is really important because if you are a working parent, you have young children, you may never get to go and see plays at your child's school. You never get to go to the sports day. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our staff in school could do that? So we did that. We found that actually giving every member of staff just half a day or 2 half days a year was really easy to cover. I mean, it's far easier than covering someone when they go off sick. But ultimately, by offering teachers this little bit of flexibility, it reduced staff sickness in our schools significantly. And actually me on the phone at 7 o'clock in the morning, or worse, 6 in the morning, trying to get staff cover is far harder than me trying to arrange cover when I know about it in advance. So the gift of time was a fantastic thing. It is tokenistic, admittedly, but it worked. And so we were able to create a policy that not only put in a few perks such as that, but also looked at staff wellbeing in the long term. We have things such as mental health first aiders, which is minimal cost to a school, but really demonstrates that you are focusing on the adults' wellbeing and mental health. So ultimately, with my governor hat on, with my trustee hat on, what I would just say is to talk to your senior leaders and kind of find out how are they measuring wellbeing in the school? And ultimately, what are they offering? Is it tokenistic? Or actually, is it something that's really going to make the difference in the long term? Is it value for money? And what is the impact on the pupils? And that's what we've learnt here at Charles Dickens Primary School. So I think I'm pretty much up to time now, so I will hand back.
Lovely. Thank you ever so much, Michael. I do have a couple of questions, but we'll go straight to Mark and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end. So over to you, Mark, and if you can unmute, we'll just check it's all working.
See that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Over to you. Thanks.
Okay. And you can see the full screen one, not the presenter one, yeah?
Yes, we can. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, brilliant. That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for having me along, and I'm delighted to be here with fellow governors. What I was asked to talk about, spare me 1 second, technical hitch of go to webinar. Okay, so what I've been asked to talk about is the key issue for boards looking at staff wellbeing, the benefits of making it your focus, and how you might go about monitoring the effectiveness of any provision. But it is always difficult to know where to pitch in events like this, as I know there's going to be governors and trustees attending with a range of terms, different backgrounds and experiences. So I'm simply going to talk about what I've learned as a governor, trustee and chair over the last 20 years, and the added lessons that I've got from working with schools professionally and in building a staff wellbeing business. And I hope that's going to provide a few takeaways for everyone that's listening. And of course, you're going to have access to my slides and links to sources for all the information I talk about following the webinar. So what are some of the key issues for boards? Well, it's to understand what staff wellbeing means in the context of schools. It's to know where to start and what has the biggest impact for staff. It's to be able to apply your personal knowledge and experience effectively as a governor or trustee. And unless you've worked in schools or another sector with similar structure and challenges, this can actually be quite difficult. In schools, as you know, staff have much less discretionary time, particularly those in the classroom. It can be much more difficult to give and receive support. There's also a need as governors to understand where staff wellbeing really fits as a priority for your head teacher, principal or CEO, and related to this, to see how as a board we can ensure that staff wellbeing has the focus it needs and deserves and isn't seen as less important than that for students or their outcomes. And we've already heard from other speakers about what we mean by staff wellbeing and the focus around supporting staff. And that's one side. How do you help staff help themselves and support those staff members who are managing such things as mental ill health and other challenges? And the second, and what I'll probably touch on more, is on the creation of an environment where staff thrive and can do their very best work, and how boards can support, facilitate and enable that with their leaders. So it's about making staff wellbeing simply a part of the school culture. And in many ways, it's like building a house. The first thing is school leaders, how can we help school leaders put down the right foundations, which means establishing effective leadership behaviours and having the right supporting processes in place. Instead, many schools do choose to build the loft and first floor first. Their answer, as Michael said, sometimes can be tokenistic, to have a wellbeing day, perhaps book a Zoom session, provide cakes or share resources. And there's nothing wrong with any of those. And it is really important that we do have support for those that need it. But many of these are not the place to start or the things to do unless you have those firm foundations of staff wellbeing in place. If a staff member doesn't feel valued or supported, if they don't enjoy their job, then after they've eaten their cake or spent their time being pampered, what's really changed? So as governors, it's part of our role to help ensure that the causes of poor wellbeing are the things that are being addressed rather than symptoms, and that we help deliver long-term change rather than sticking plaster solutions. You can see on screen some words, and these come from Professor Sir Cary Cooper. And while his name sounds like it should really belong to a cowboy, he is one of the UK's leading experts on employee and organisational wellbeing. And it's really hard for schools to get this part right, given how line management is often and largely structured across the sector. On first leadership appointment, particularly for teaching staff, they usually continue to carry out 95% of their previous job, teaching. So they have such limited time for one-to-ones and to give support to others. And when I became a governor for the very first time, I found this quite difficult to understand as I was applying my years of senior leadership experience in banking. And actually really taking the time to understand things like this has allowed me to ask better questions and provide more effective support and challenge. And the final part of this section on key issues is to understand where staff wellbeing sits as a priority for your head principal or CEO. and whether it is or can become as important to focus as that for students if it isn't already. And do we as boards also remember that the head teacher, the CEO, the principal and senior team members are also staff members? And how do we support them, and are we including this topic in any discussions and monitoring that we carry out? We've all heard of the importance of putting on your own oxygen mask first. And if we want students to have the best experience and well-being, then staff have to be the key focus for boards. And it's very easy to say staff are our most important asset. We know they are what we spend most money on, and we also know that great teaching and learning is fundamental to what our schools deliver. But do our behaviours as governors and trustees and actions and those of your school leaders demonstrate that staff are our #1 priority? You know, it's actions rather than words. And how well is staff wellbeing represented within the school vision and values, and from this into leadership and staff objectives? And this isn't just about having them written down, but it's about explicitly spelling out what we would expect to see every day. So that was just a very brief look at some of the key issues that boards might be considering. And there are really good reasons and benefits behind why you'd want to focus on staff wellbeing. And that's beyond that it is morally the right thing to do if that isn't enough for you. There's evidence that demonstrates improvements in staff self-reported wellbeing lead to improved financial performance and better student outcomes. And while detailed research into school staff wellbeing does remain limited still in the sector, one report by Birkbeck's College and Work-Life Support showed a statistically significant link with exam outcomes, so specifically a link to improved SATs and GCSE results and value-added progress through key stages 2 to 4. While education research is limited, there is compelling evidence from business and the health service that self-reported staff wellbeing improves results. Among the highlights from the health sector are evidence of a causal link between staff wellbeing and multiple outcomes, including staff absenteeism, turnover, staff cover spend, patient satisfaction, infection and mortality rates. And we also know that the associated financial costs of these can be significant. The other finding from the health sector is that it's really important to monitor employee wellbeing and target resources to areas known to be problematic. On top of student outcome improvements, though, other benefits of improving staff wellbeing include reducing staff absence and the need for cover, and as a result, improving the continuity of teaching, improving staff attraction and retention, and reducing the need for recruitment, training and development, and reducing management time spent on other unproductive tasks. And as Sinead mentioned, the costs of this are quite significant, and you'll be able to reduce these when you tackle the 3 things we just talked about. Recoverable costs could be anything from 20 to over £100,000 for an average school, depending on size and current performance. And these figures are based on government and other estimates, and you'll be able to see these and have access to a cost calculator through the webinar follow-up information. It's also more likely you'll meet the Ofsted leadership and management judgment that now touches on staff wellbeing, and I'm sure once inspectors return to schools, this is likely to be an even greater focus for them. And finally, teachers are much more likely to have better physical and mental health if we're supporting them, and as a result, role model this for students. So assuming that you are bought in as a governing or trustee board to the need and benefits of focusing on staff wellbeing, where might you start if you want to better support improving it and monitor the provision that is already in place? Well, if your governing bodies like ones I've been a part of or have talked with, then you may spend much of your time scrutinising pupil and student performance and the quality of teaching. We have committees that look at both of these. Schools track pupil and student performance constantly and report it to us regularly, and we as governors and trustees ask questions and satisfy ourselves that the outcomes are as good as they could be, or at least steps are being taken to get back on track. Are we doing the same for staff? School data provides clues to the likely wellbeing of staff and is the place to start. And you can review this at board meetings and ask for information to be reported, but we don't want to add significant workload, as we've already heard. So we've got to find ways and ask how we can most easily use or pull information from existing school systems and records rather than create our own. And data for boards to consider include staff sickness and absence rates, staff turnover, how often your employee assistance scheme, counselling, provision, occupational health is used. And if you haven't got an employee assistance scheme, looking at how you should have one. And I know Sinead and her organisation can help with that. We should be looking at staff grievances, disputes or instances of poor behaviour, and school performance trends. In all of these, you're considering both the current situation and how this might compare to the national position where known, or what you might expect, as well as looking at changes over time. High absence rates, turnover, use of services or grievances, as well as a declining trend in student outcomes, all point to likely lower staff wellbeing. And where these are reported, governors can ask good questions about what might be happening and what is being done to address them and provide the right kind of support. In addition, school leaders can seek staff feedback through group discussions, one-to-one conversations, or through targeting specific situations. So these would include return to work interviews, welfare discussions, and exit interviews. You can ask for anonymised summary headlines to be included in any reporting. Running a staff survey that addresses the major causes of poor wellbeing is also something I'd recommend. And using a third party can be a good way to validate or confirm internal views of staff wellbeing. Schools can also run their own, and we're always happy to give advice to boards and school leaders who want to do this. And whatever you use, I recommend you ensure it has a strong evidence base, that it is ideally independently evaluated, because you need to be confident of what the answers are telling you to be able to benchmark performance and ensure it is reliable and consistent so that you can continue to use it and track progress over time. In the same way as you create reporting and a process for maintaining and improving student outcomes, we want the same for staff wellbeing, to systemise how schools improve it and governors, trustees and boards monitor it. And once you have an effective system in place, with a report each term, it will become much easier to see what is happening. You can ask the right questions and both support and constructively challenge as a board as actions become part of the school development plan. So that was a really quick look at the key issues for boards, the evidence and benefits for a focus on staff wellbeing, and how you might more effectively measure the provision in your school. Follow-up information will be made available, and we've also got information on our website, including more on practical steps for schools, including 14 specific things that head teachers have taken to improve the wellbeing of their staff. I'm also very happy to answer any questions. So feel free to get in touch. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day and for all the work you do as governors and for listening to us. So I'm done. So I'll just.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's great. I do have a question for let's see, who was it for? For Michael. Sorry, I'll just drop back to Michael. Alistair has asked. I understand the difference between strategic and operational. Obviously, we know that governors should focus on the strategic, but many governors might have skills that help in the situation. For example, communications, health and safety, or crisis management. Is there any way in which you can see governors helping to lighten the load of staff?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think just the offer. I think if you do have those skills, just letting the senior team know. And I think as long as it's on the school's terms and it's not additional work for them or many additional meetings, then I think most schools would welcome to know that there's someone on the board that could certainly help them. So yeah, I think so.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that one? No.
Yeah, I can say. I mean, obviously I've got quite a bit of business experience from 23 years in retail banking and also now 10 years working with various schools. So, it would be very remiss of me not to share things that I've learned that I think would be helpful. But as Michael says, it's to do it in a way that is effectively a non-executive, someone who's offering support, not taking over or demanding, and making sure that we do it in such a way that wherever possible, we're minimising or actually not adding anything to what the school have to do.
Thank you. We've got another question around staff wellbeing being a priority, which is great and within the school's vision, but how do we persuade parents that their children's education and wellbeing benefit from putting staff first? Who would like to come in on that one? Sinead, would you like to come in on that one?
I mean, I think this is, You know, in this crisis, I think parents have been both amazing and sometimes the source of some of the biggest difficulties in the schools that I work with. And I'm a parent of a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, so this is dear to my heart. I think that one of the things that can be helpful is for the governors to reach out to the PTA. If you don't already have a strong relationship with the PTA, there can be good communications through the PTA with the parent community. And I think involving the head of school in any kind of communication that might go on there is really important, because you don't want messages going out. You know, the last thing I imagine Michael wants is his parents receiving a message going, the poor teachers, they're falling over, they can't possibly manage. And this is not helpful. So I think the way in which messages around teacher wellbeing are played out to the parent community really matter. But I think most parents, you know, we've seen a massive uptick in the general public with the engagement in mental health across the piece. I think if we make it clear that you know, the reason that we need to pay attention to teachers is, of course, for their own selves, but also so that they can do the best job possible for the kids in the room, and whether it's on site or online. I think most people will get that. Not everybody will. You know, there will be people who resent it or dislike it or whatever. But I think as long as you can be really clear, the rationale is the same as we're discussing today, and parents are capable of taking that in, I think.
I think a lot of people having experienced homeschooling have a newfound respect for teachers, don't they? Maybe that will lead on. Yeah. Linda, did you want to come in there? I saw. No. Okay.
Yeah. Can I just add, because I think there are things that schools can do, but I also think it's beholden on us as a group as well to be canvassing. You know, this has got to create a bit of a change and a movement, because the evidence for putting staff first, for me, is quite clear. There's strong research and evidence to show it. So it's how we get that information out as a group of people. So there's roles for goodness for schools, and I know we're all doing our bit, but I guess there might be a way we can coordinate better and start working more together, even where we're competitors, to really help get this message out. Because it's quite hard to share individual messages to schools. When I'm doing my talks around, I often pick on people outside schools, so Richard Branson, for whatever you think of his moral bits, but if you look at how he treats the staff, certainly prior to COVID, I think COVID has given some challenges for business as well, where he puts staff way above customers in a view that actually it's the best way to treat customers. So I think there's some really good things. It's how we put it in language that the different audiences understand, and how we kind of promote that to support schools, rather than thinking each school individually is going to be able to tackle it.
Thank you. We're fast running out of time, so just one more question probably. I've got somebody who's a new community governor in a primary school. What would be the one thing as the designated wellbeing focal point of the governing board that I could do to initiate a constructive discussion within the board and senior management without adding to their workload? So if we could take it in turn, one thing that you think is really key for a new wellbeing governor to take away. Linda, do you want to go first?
I think the most important thing is to get the baseline. So unfortunately, there is going to be some workload implication here, but the trade-off is going to be understanding. So I think that the first step is always going to be to do a survey to find out exactly where people are, so that you can measure progress and also know where to focus your energies.
Thank you. Mark, one thing, first thing to do?
Well, I'm going to agree to Linda, but with a step before it. And obviously, as somebody who provides surveys, I'm delighted that Linda's saying that. But I think there is a step before that, and that's actually just starting the conversation and just actually getting people to talk about this and getting the cards on the table, so that actually we know. I've done a few schools where governing boards have insisted on a school doing a survey, for example, and it doesn't work. There has to be buy-in from everybody around the table working together, or at least the majority. So I'd say the first thing is you just start having the conversation and share what's important and share why, and get the consensus, because then it'll be much easier to move on to the baseline, the survey, and things that follow.
Thank you. Michael?
I agree with both Linda and Mark. Absolutely, I think just getting it on the agenda as a standing item, so it's a shared responsibility. It doesn't just sit with you, but actually it's the whole board's responsibility and senior leaders' responsibility to take this seriously. So on the agenda, I would say.
Brilliant. And to wrap us up with Sinead, is there anything extra that you wanted to add?
I think for me, the thing that we're most concerned about that we see in the data is the health and well-being of senior leaders. And so I would say for the board to look really explicitly at the senior leadership team, that's heads and deputies and assistants. And I think to have the conversation with them about what is realistic, because I think what we also observe is a lot of senior teams going above and beyond and feeling like they need to do everything. And it's not sustainable. But as governors, we need to help them decide what to not do and give them permission to not do it, and let them know that we wholly support them looking after themselves. Like we get that that's the right way to run a school.
Thank you. I think that's a really valuable point. That what not to do is really key. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks to all of you out there who have listened in. I hope it was a really valuable session. Please do access our website for the resources that we've been putting together with organisations including the speakers today. What I would say is that the recording of the webinar will be available either later today, hopefully, or if not tomorrow morning, and we'll also share all the slide decks that the presenters had. So please do access those and share them with your governing boards or other people who might be interested. Thanks ever so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.